Hey everyone, and welcome to this next video tutorial. So this video, I've mentioned this on my page a couple of times, is going to be a redo of just shooting the building of the base that I did for this guy here, the Mega Boss, for the Ever Chosen competition. So yeah, unfortunately the original footage that I filmed while I was building this went missing before I could edit it. So unfortunately, yeah, you won't be seeing that. But what I will be doing is doing another version. I'm not really kind of building this for a model in mind. I'm just kind of going through my process of how I go about putting together a base like this. So as you can see, I've got some tools laid out in front, usual kind of things, clippers, hobby knife there, sculpting tool I'll be using a little bit later on. Super glue is always good. And then we've got some hobby sand, which is a usual thing, pretty common thing that you'd use for basing. These bits of wood here are actually pine bark that I've just found in a local park, grabbed out of the garden. But you can purchase it. I know you can purchase it in Australia at some places, hardware stores and gardening stores and things like that. But I mean, yeah, just see where you can find it. Yeah, so first things first, I like to do a little bit of planning behind bases most of the time. Sometimes I just kind of go with the flow and just kind of throw something together. But for this one, because I was going with a very specific sort of theme, I wanted to do a little bit more planning. So one thing that I like to do is sometimes do a bit of a sketch. So this, just using some of my illustration skills, just a little sketch of the kind of vision I had in mind for what a Shyish wasteland should look like. I like the idea of these kind of rib cages coming out of the ground. Obviously lots of skulls and things around, rocks and dead trees. Luckily, I managed to get my hands on the zombie dragon kit, obviously, which I used for the skull that I converted on the Mega Boss. So, and that has some nice rib cages and things like that, which I did use on the original base. I've still got some of those bits that I can use on this one that I'm putting together now. And then with that kind of sketching out inspiration kind of thing, this might not be something that everyone would do. Sometimes it just helps me to kind of just like put something down on paper just to kind of get the juices flowing. Have a kind of rough idea of the aesthetic that you're trying to achieve. And then this basically, planning out the base, how you actually want it to look. And I did deviate from this slightly, as you can see. I don't know if I can get it in the shot. But the rib cage obviously was in the final position. The tree out the back. That skull ended up moving towards the middle, and then adding that extra bit of the rib cage bones kind of there, and then obviously scattered some skulls around. So obviously when you're with this stage, I'm kind of thinking about where's the model going to stand. Are the elements on the base going to work with where the model's standing, and a lot of that actually just comes down to doing these sketches helps, but sometimes actually doing a kind of draft or a mock-up of how the base is going to look, and then kind of playing around with how the model will sit with that. So, like I said, I don't have a model that I'm actually going to put on here, so I'm just kind of going for it. But, I would be sort of like dry fitting the model on there and playing around with the elements and making sure that the model would, sort of sit on there and stand upright and wouldn't look too kind of awkward on the base. So So that's the kind of planning stage of things, and it does help. So this one, I did the planning for the original base. I haven't really done much kind of sketching and planning for this one, but I'm obviously going with the same aesthetic. So what I start off with is, with this base, I wanted to kind of bulk things out a bit, get a bit more height. So that's why I like to use these bits of pine bark. I've got some more here. And you can see the texture on them is just really, really good for creating a rock feel. It's kind of like that sort of layered slate kind of look. It just works really, really well. So some of these areas will be exposed. Some of it I will later on, once I get to it, I'll go over with a bit of milliput and fill some of those gaps, because, there's these big gaps here, which, could work, but I want it to kind of have a bit more of the flatness like I did with the other base. So the best thing to do with this, obviously, you're getting a rough idea of where things are going to sit. I'm going to have this here. This is, like I said, a little bit different to the other one, but still having some of these kind of rib cage elements hanging out, kind of a tusk, a horn there, the tree at the back. So what I like to do, these obviously aren't glued on, so I'm just going to take them off. To get these stuck down, you don't really want to be waiting around for too long. Super glue can work, but sometimes I feel it's not the best for giving a long-lasting kind of hold. It can sometimes become a bit brittle and bits start to fall off. Not only that, but it actually does take a little bit longer to dry, especially with organic elements like this, which are very porous. It tends to sometimes just soak into the wood, which you don't really want. You want it to, sit close to the surface so it's binding to the base a bit more. But that's, that doesn't really matter too much. So what I like to use is hot glue. It's cheap and easy to use. It works really well. It bonds really well. And the best thing is it dries really quick. So you can get away with putting quite a bit on there. Obviously you get those little stringy bits, but as long as you're careful to kind of remove those afterwards, then there's not that much of a deal. And obviously this is kind of just like fitting a jigsaw puzzle together. I need to move that apart a bit more. You have a little bit of working time with it before it fully sets really hard. This gap here is not what I intended, but it's not that big an issue because it's going to be pretty easy to fill out. I can use some other small bits of pine, and that's going to sit there quite nicely actually. And then just that bit there. The stringy bits can get a bit annoying. But yeah, hot glue is just so good for doing this kind of thing. Even if you're building, terrain for a table, you got to watch out for some materials like polystyrene or whatever, which doesn't react very well to heat. It will tend to melt. You kind of probably don't want to use it for that. But just even for these plastic bits, I'm just going to use it as well. Maybe I should have planned this out a bit more. But this is the beauty of using this pine bark as well, is it's very easy to cut and shape and mess around with. So, if you do put something not where you intended it to be, it's not too hard to change things. Let's grab a smaller bit. So this one I might just have a look at how it might fit in there. And just mark where I'm going to cut it. Cool. So that should just shove a bit of glue in there. Cool. And the last plastic element, obviously, you know, your usual kind of working with plastic. I've obviously, even though it is just, you know, part of a base, get rid of your mold lines. Otherwise, you know, those things can become a bit obvious on the final paint job. Right. Oh, it's going to need a little bit more drying time to hold there. All right, so that's all of those elements attached to the base now. Yeah, like I said, this bit did require a little bit more drying time, but honestly, it was only like a couple minutes. The hot glue dries quite quickly. Yeah, so the next stage is moving on to starting to fill in some of the gaps. Building, filling up in these areas here, and what we do with that is, as I mentioned, using this stuff. So if you've never used this or you don't even own any, I would highly recommend getting some, especially for doing this basing sort of stuff. So it comes in this little box, and it's a 2-part putty sort of deal. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that just like green stuff? Which it kind of is, in that, you mix the 2 parts together and then it starts to set. But what makes this stuff different is it's more of a consistency. It's quite similar to clay. So green stuff has more kind of an elastic kind of feel with it, and when green stuff sets, when it fully hardens, it's still quite soft. Whereas this stuff, when it hardens, it dries rock hard. Cool. So I've just pulled off roughly equal parts of it, and then it's just a matter of kneading them together until you've got a nice even mix. Cool. All right, just been going for a couple of minutes with that. So what I like to do now is part of using this stuff is covering up some of the bits which don't look very fitting, like this. This, as I mentioned, this is part of the zombie dragon, and I don't know, this is some bit that connects to another bit, so that obviously doesn't look natural and realistic, so that's a bit that we're going to cover up. So obviously this is pretty self-explanatory, but just take a bit off there. The beautiful thing about Milliput as well is you can use water to lubricate the sculpting when you're working with it, which you can't really get away with when you're working with green stuff. So the Milliput actually combines, like I said, it's more of kind of a clay consistency, it kind of has more of the properties of a clay, so the water will actually mix into it. So that kind of presents some other kind of opportunities for potential uses for it if you wanted to thin it down and mix it with some water and thin it down and use it to fill some finer gaps and things like that. You can always do that. Try and make this bit fit inside there. Got this gap under the bones there. Squash it in. So with what I'm doing now, there's not really that much of a need to get things looking super smooth and refined, because over the top of most of this milliput area, if not all of it, I'm going to be applying that modelling sand. So yeah, don't be too finicky with it, because it's mostly just going to get covered up. Well, I mean, what you could do actually, going back to the hot glue, is you can actually use that to fill some of these gaps. You can, and it's in some ways easier to apply. You can just kind of squirt it into that gap there, and it's, because it's quite sort of a hard to reach kind of gap. The only thing you got to watch out for is this kind of bubbling, or sort of, I don't know what you call that, but that kind of look there where it actually just looks like this mound of glue. So with this bit, I am actually going to use some milliput to go over that because it looks a bit unnatural, looks a bit silly. Like I said, these kind of gaps here, I could have got away with just squirting some hot glue in there. But I'm just going to go with the milliput if it stops sticking to my fingers. All right, so that's that with all the milliput added. And so filled in all the gaps. Some of these bits, like I've left this bit in the middle exposed because I thought it'd be nice to have a bit of a rock in there. Pretty straightforward. Yeah. So the next element that I'm adding is just some skulls. So I like to do this when the milliput's still a bit wet. So I'm going to do it now. I do still use a bit of super glue just to help it along. So I've gone, and you probably might not be able to see it, but I've kind of marked out where I'm potentially going to place some of the skulls, just to plan things out a little bit. And then I'm just using, that bit's going to come off, I think. Just glue it on there because I like where it sits. I like the idea of maybe an orc skull just resting up the top here on these rocks. So even on the milliput areas, I would still put down a bit of super glue. I'm pushing it in a little bit, but the glue is just sort of there to help it along, to help it bind a bit better. one in this little gap here. It's just like this stage is just having a bit of fun playing around with it. I'm gonna stick a little one under here if it'll fit. Maybe that guy. No, half one maybe. Like he's becoming part of the scenery. Maybe just one in here. That's an orc skull, by the way, which I thought would be fitting. Kind of around the narrative that I was trying to build with the mega boss. There's this warband of orcs causing havoc in Shyish. Where can we go next? Maybe another orc one over this side. Just that kind of half one. Missing the jaw. Maybe do something like this. Cut the jawbone a bit. Partly sort of buried in the dirt. And I'll just leave it at that, actually. Yeah, so scattering around some other little visual elements, building a bit of narrative with it. I mean, it's the Warhammer universe. Why not have a bunch of skulls on a base? It's always works. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. So at this stage, I'm going to let them dry a little bit because I've used the super glue, and let the milliput dry a little bit. But just really, the next stage is doing the sand. And the other thing that I like to do is actually seal the rocks, the pine bark, because it's an organic element. As I mentioned earlier, it's quite porous, so it absorbs liquids a lot. So, and that it would even include the paint. So not only that, but sealing it helps to build the structure of it and just help to prevent it from breaking up in future. So that will be the last part of the video. All right, so that has been drying for about half an hour now, maybe. So everything's sort of set, super glue set. The milliput's still quite wet. It started to set a little bit. It's not really that much of an issue if we start going over that now. One of the really good things about milliput as well is that it doesn't shrink a whole lot as it dries, so it won't affect too much if I start to apply this the sand over the top. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing that now. So I've got on here my PVA glue and some water, and it's not quite a 50-50, but it's close. The reason I mix the water into it is it just helps it to helps with the application, helps to get it to flow a bit more. It still adheres quite well. so it's not going to change that a whole lot. Obviously, highly recommend using old brushes for this. Yeah, for obvious reasons. If it sits on the brush, it's going to start to set, and it will destroy your brushes. Obviously, you don't want to use a brush that's too big for this, because you're not going to be able to get into some of those recesses, some of these hard to reach areas. So as I mentioned earlier, over this milliput area, for the most part, I want to be applying the sand. So pretty straightforward. If you've done any, basing of this sort in the past, you kind of know what's going on. I've just kind of had to kind of go over that face of that skull there to get it into that gap. But we can fix that up after we apply the sand. Sometimes if you make mistakes with the glue, don't freak out too much about trying to fix it up while the glue's still wet. Sometimes it's easier just to wait and kind of flick the sand off later on. So I'm just going to apply a little bit more just to some of these rocks as well, just little patchy areas, just to kind of blend things in a bit more, get a kind of more of a unified look. Alright, so all that glue is applied. Now we're going to start applying the sand. So this is a little trick that I like to use. Just a bit of paper on the bench. Just take your mix. So this is a mix of, I think, 3 different grains of sand. They are proper marketed, modeling sand. But I mean, you can just, obviously you just use stuff in the garden, and then you've already got potentially a mix of different grains and things. But I like to have a bit of a mix to keep things looking a bit more natural, a bit more realistic, rather than just having one kind of size of sand. So just start applying that over the top. And you can obviously see why the paper's there now. Obviously turn it around, look for where there might be some glue showing through, just to get try and get every spot. Need to get a little bit more there. Alright. So there are, obvious spots where you're going to want to wipe off any of that sand that's sitting on some areas. Obviously around the rim here, you don't really want it there. I think that's just sort of sticking to the milliput that's on the side of the base, but that's easy to fix. Cool, so I'm going to put this back in there now. So now you can see why this has been really useful. Get that out of the way. So one of the other things that you got to look for if you might not really care about this too much. If it's for maybe a gaming base or something like that. But if you're going for, display kind of deal, you want to look for bits of sand that I like to call as, I like to refer as kind of gravity defying. So bits, this is a prime example here. There's bits sitting on that edge of the tusk, and there's kind of, no realistic way for it to be doing that. So we just kind of push it off. Sometimes you can, push it and then kind of shake it off a bit or blow it off. A bit on this rib here, that bone. So it's just kind of, one of those paying attention to detail kind of things. Like even this rock here, it's kind of floating above the others. So, want to just pay attention to those kinds of things. Because we're going to go, once that glue underneath is set, we're going to go over with a watered down mix of PVA to help to set things on there better. So it's important to go over this stage and get rid of any unwanted bits, because once you go over with that second layer of PVA glue, it's going to start to set things on, and you might get these Spider-Man bits of sand that are defying gravity hanging on the branches of the tree there. Cheeky little bits of sand. Some areas it might look okay because it might just look like it's, part of the rock or whatever, but especially hanging off a bit of a bone or something, you kind of want to deal with those bits. Yeah, it's just, like I said, one of those little attention to detail things, especially for competitions and things. I've only entered Golden Demon once, but I know that, the judges can be quite pedantic about things and they look for little details like that. So if you're aspiring to enter a competition of, where the judges might be a bit more that way inclined, then you want to deal with those sorts of things. Yeah, so that's what we're looking at right now. I'm actually really happy with how this is looking. There's some nice sort of variations in the levels, and really nice kind of rock-like surfaces presenting themselves in this nice mix of different grains of sand. So the next stage, I'm going to start sealing these rocks. Now, ideally, you probably want to let the sand set, but as I'm filming this with not a huge amount of time, I'm going to go and start doing that now. And in hindsight, I wouldn't have applied these bits of sand on there. But we'll just go ahead and do it anyway. Okay, so I've just gone and thinned this glue down a bit more. And now it's kind of at a consistency that's kind of paint-like, I guess. So with this, I find it's better to use obviously an old brush, but one that's got a bit more of a bit more body to the bristles, so that you can kind of have a bit more applied, or this glue mix applied to the brush. And then, just going over these surfaces of the bark, try and get in the recesses as well. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just to seal it, really, to get it ready for the paint. As I mentioned, it's a porous surface, so it's going to absorb the moisture, so the paint might have some issues applying to it. So yeah, so we do this, and obviously a big reason for doing this is to protect the surface as well from breakage and stuff, because the pine bark's very layered. You want to keep those layers together, so this glue is going to help with that, or so we'd hope. Obviously if you throw the base around, it's probably going to break. But I can't imagine what circumstance you'd be throwing it around. So but yeah, that's what we were kind of looking for. A nice coating on it. You're not gonna lose much detail at all with that. You might be thinking, wow, that's quite thick, but as it dries, you'll see you've still got a lot of the detail retaining. All right, so there we go. That's that glue mix applied to all the rock surfaces, or the bark surfaces. So really, the only stage left for this, which I can't really show you because the PVA is still drying underneath, and I don't want to disturb it too much. Underneath the sand, that is. But yeah, so the last thing that I'd be doing is applying a similar, thing to over the bark, a sealer over the sand and gravel areas. So I actually have a pre-mixed little bottle here that I use for all of my basing. A lot of not that I've worked on an army in a long time, but what I like to do with this is pour it into another kind of cup or something, and then you can actually dip the base, like a 25 ml or 32 ml base into the mix, and then shake off the excess. But for this one, obviously, you probably don't want to dip it. So that mix is even thinner than what I've done here, and it's kind of probably like 4 parts water to 1 part glue. It's quite thin, and obviously, what I do is just gently apply it over the gravel. I don't want to do too much of it now because it's just going to disturb it. But yeah, I would probably let this dry overnight and then go ahead and seal it. It does slow things down a little bit more, but I mean, you want to make sure everything sets quite nicely on the base before you start attacking it with your paint, because that's going to potentially disturb things a lot as well. Yeah, so I think that's it. Hope that's helped someone. Hope it's given someone some inspiration, perhaps, of how I went about approaching this guy's base. Similar aesthetic. Again, I apologize that I wasn't able to show you the exact video that I was starting to film for building this base here. But in the PDF, I have coming out alongside this video, I've got the step-by-step of how I actually painted that base. So you'll be able to see that and hopefully apply that to your own work. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for your support. I'm quite happy with how things are going on the Patreon, and I'm really wanting to, you may have noticed, I'm really wanting to sort of push things as more of a community, get your input more, and really just release content and give you guys help with, what you want help with. So it's been going really well lately, and yeah, thank you so much for your continued support, and I hope this video helps you out. So yeah, thanks.